Good morning, members. My name is Franklin Thornton, and I am the committee's clerk. I will be going over some instructions to help set up your screen and explain the process we will follow for today's hearing. Please note that the instructions I'm about to give only work if you are using a computer. If you are on your phone or on a tablet, you will still be able to fully participate, but you will not be able to do the steps I'm about to describe. First, I'm going to explain how to organize your screen into grid view. Please move your cursor to the top right corner of your screen. You will see an option to click Layout. Once you click,
The subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of subcommittee any time without objection. Without objection, members of the full committee who are not members of this subcommittee is authorized to participate in today's hearing. The hearing is entitled Taking Stock of China, Inc., Examining Risks to Investors and the U.S. Posed by Foreign Issuers in U.S. Markets. I believe now the staff has some technical announcements. What? Does the staff have technical announcements? Apparently, the staff does not have technical announcements. Accordingly, I will recognize myself for 4 minutes for an opening statement. I believe the chair of the full committee will be here soon for a 1-minute opening statement as well. If not, I will also claim her 1 minute and reiterate some of these same points. 4 minutes will begin. The intertwining of the American and Chinese economies has given China substantial power here in the United States. It really hasn't given America any power, political power in Beijing. We have great witnesses here today, but the most articulate witnesses are those who are not here today. Their decision to pull out of this hearing due to pressure, economic pressure, speaks loudly to China's strong economic power over politics and economics here in the United States. There are those who think that we shouldn't encourage or allow investment in China because it means American capital is flowing to their economy. But let's remember this is a two-way street. Some $1.2 trillion of American capital is invested in China, in their securities, not to mention $116 billion of direct investment. But some $2 trillion of Chinese capital is invested in American securities. But we do have to make sure, if it is going to be a two-way street, that it's a fair street. We've heard of Luckin Coffee, Evergrande, and Didi. Luckin Coffee tells us that we need good audits and good oversight of those audits, and the PCAOB needs to oversee the audits. Didi illustrates the issue of whether the boards of directors of companies are loyal to the shareholders and whether the corporations have property rights that are protected by the courts of China, or whether you in fact are investing in a company whose assets could disappear due to capricious government action. The SEC has created special rules for foreign private issuers based on the idea that, say, that private issuer from abroad is from the United Kingdom, where you get all the investor protection from the host country, and then we'll just add a little bit of American investor protection. We don't need all of the usual American investor protection. That model obviously needs to be turned on its head in dealing with China, where you get little or no investor protection from the home country. We see that China is able to pressure index funds to include Chinese companies, but it's not Chinese companies that are in the index funds. An index fund may choose to put the 1,000 biggest companies in the world in the index, but you can't buy Alibaba. You buy Alibaba of the Cayman Islands. Now, Alibaba is one of the 1,000 biggest companies in the world, but Alibaba Cayman Islands, the Cayman Islands isn't even one of the 1,000 biggest islands in the world. You're investing in a shell company that invests in another shell company that has a contractual relationship with Alibaba. Does that belong in an index? But we do see that China is able to pressure Morgan Stanley and others to include these questionable entities in indexes. Now, when you invest in China, you're investing in a police state to some degree, one that imprisons 1 million Uyghurs in Xinjiang. We'll be discussing a number of bills here before us. Two that were noticed early. It accelerates the Foreign Holding Companies Accountability Act. A second deals with the Uyghur Forced Labor Disclosure Act. I've also quickly, in advance of this hearing, distributed bills designed to force a review by the SEC of the special status they give private foreign issuers to see if that's relevant to companies based in China. A bill to prohibit a phony name from being used. You shouldn't call yourself Alibaba if you're not Alibaba, but you're really Cayman Islands Alibaba. And finally, we'll get into the VIEs, which are not real companies, and whether they belong in indexes. At this point, I will recognize the ranking member for his opening statement, and I wonder whether I should recognize him for 4 minutes or for 5 minutes. Do you have all the Republican time?
Yes, at this point I do. And,
then you do. I recognize you for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, let me start before I get into my comments. I'm curious if you could clarify two things. One, those bills that you were just talking about, they were noticed for this hearing, or did you just introduce them? Because we were not aware of that.
Those are at most discussion drafts that I've circulated just yesterday. I can't say,
Okay.
They're among the many things that will be discussed here today.
All right. Well, looking forward to getting our hands on those and having that conversation. And then I'd appreciate it too if you'd clarify. You mentioned the 4 witnesses that we have before us, but mentioned that there were some others who either refused or didn't come or felt pressure. Because I fully believe that we've seen that. With whether it's entertainment companies, others, the NBA, there's been a lot of pressure, but I'm curious if you could clarify that.
I'm not here to end any careers on Wall Street by explicitly identifying names. There are those who we were in discussions with, some who had actually agreed to come testify, then notified us that they decided it was in the interest of their careers that they not appear as before us. We decided not to have one of those in the Foreign Affairs Committee where we've had people that might be subject to torture. We've had screens and muffled voices. We chose not to do that.
I'm going to reclaim my time because I do need to get through my statement. And I too am not in the business of endangering that, but that certainly that's a significant, serious accusation that is getting thrown out. So I think it is important that we begin this hearing by level setting and acknowledging what's really happening with China and the CCP, which is the Chinese Communist Party right now. And we often just use the acronym and kind of blow over what it actually stands for. China is gearing up for a fight to attempt to replace the U.S. as the premier world leader, both economically and geopolitically. China's preparation to compete with us relies on ensuring the CCP's control is absolute. That's exactly what the CCP has been working towards. It's critical that we as policymakers acknowledge this fact. If we don't, we're missing a bigger picture and a bigger threat, and doing so will lead to short-sighted half measures in response to China's threat. I'm a little afraid we may be losing sight with today's hearing. I just want to make sure that we're not. China's threat is far greater than just that of investment-related risk. It's far more multidimensional, and therefore we have to be far more multidimensional. Legislation like the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act, which passed on a bipartisan basis last Congress, represents one of the important pieces that should be a well-rounded, multi-pronged approach from Washington. It properly corrected an investor protection imbalance whereby China and Hong Kong-based companies were operating under different rules than everyone else. That certainly cannot stand. But we should be focusing on how to complement the HFCAA with policies pulled from a diverse toolkit beyond the securities laws. For example, attempting to deal with the threat of China through mandatory disclosures that are unrelated to financial materiality for foreign policy purposes, I believe, is also a bit short-sighted. These disclosures will not likely change China's behavior, especially considering these disclosure requirements would be applicable to all public companies no matter where they're incorporated. The SEC tends to be the wrong agency to address national security and human rights issues, and we've seen that before with things like the failed conflict minerals, provisions of Dodd-Frank, et cetera. For example, we should be sanctioning Chinese firms instead that pose national security threats and imposing export controls to deprive these Chinese firms, parentheses government, of advanced technologies needed for their quest for global dominance. Fostering entrepreneurship and encouraging business activity should be another policy priority of ours to deal with China's threat. Chinese regulators have been cracking down on their own entrepreneurs and shutting them off from foreign investment. So we have an opportunity here, folks. In response, doubling down on American economic growth through innovation and promoting economic freedom would be a tremendously effective approach for us in contrast to the top-down authoritarian approach of the CCP. Again, we have an opportunity, let's seize it. Fostering entrepreneurship and encouraging business activity are squarely within our subcommittee's jurisdiction, explicitly within the SEC's mission. So let's discuss those policies. Outcompeting China in the long term will depend on American economic growth. If we're only focused on addressing China through ineffective mandatory disclosures and not growing our economy, then we're choosing to face the threat of China with both hands tied behind our back. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the distinguished ranking member for his statement. I will recognize the chair of the full committee for 1 minute and also indicate that if the chair of the full committee wants to be the first questioner, that would be my honor as well. And she's recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chair Sherman. I'm very pleased you're holding this hearing today. Our capital markets are the envy of the world, raising trillions of dollars for large and small businesses and supporting the retirement and savings of investors. Our markets work because participants have to play by the rules. For example, companies that want to raise capital gain the trust and confidence of investors by providing access to reliable and accurate financial information. Our regulators then have unhindered access to both this information and those who audit the information. However, some jurisdictions, like the People's Republic of China, have created obstacles to this effective oversight and are undermining the bedrock of investor confidence. So I look forward to reviewing the actions Congress and the SEC can take to protect our markets. And I thank you, and I yield back my time.
Thank you. Today, we welcome the testimony of our distinguished and in some cases courageous witnesses. We first have Ms. Karen Sutter, specialist in Asian trade and finance with the Congressional Research Service. Next, we will hear from Samantha Ross, the founder of AssuranceMark, the Investors Consortium for Assurance. We'll then hear from Claire Cho, a senior analyst with RWR Advisory Group. And finally, we'll hear from Eric Lorber, senior director of the Center on Economic and Financial Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Witnesses are reminded that their oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes. You should, of course, your entire statement will be made part of the record. You should be able to see the timer on your desk in front of you that will indicate how much time you have left. When you have 1 minute remaining, a yellow light will appear. I'll ask you to be mindful of the timer, and when the red light appears, either be done or wrap up very quickly. And without objection, as I've mentioned, your written statement will be made part of the record. Ms. Sutter, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning. Chairman Sherman, Ranking Member Huizenga, distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting Congressional Research Service to testify today. I would like to raise 6 points today for your consideration. To start, I'd like to discuss how China is selectively opening its financial markets to a few U.S. investment firms, allowing them to expand China offerings to U.S. investors. These firms see growth opportunities in China, but their market participation is still curtailed by Chinese government controls and the dominant market position of China's large state banks. Some U.S. firms and investors may profit from investments in Chinese companies, but these transactions appear to leave U.S. investors in a passive role in 3 respects. 1, U.S. financial investors cannot leverage the productive industrial or technological capabilities that their capital may help China to develop. Number 2, U.S. financial investments do not appear to open China's economy to U.S. competition, especially in strategic industries that they fund. Number 3, the Chinese government can exercise control, influence, and discretion over U.S. investments and the underlying business operations and assets that are in China. Next, I'd like to discuss the limited and targeted nature of China's financial investment openings to date, which appear designed in part to attract capital, U.S. capital, to areas where China's economy is weak, such as bad assets and debt. Increased U.S. capital flows to China's debt markets could create growth opportunities, but also could create increased U.S. risk exposure by placing more U.S. capital in areas where there are systemic market risks. The Chinese government's current efforts to address debt and overcapacity in its property market highlights an example of such risks. Third, the Chinese government appears to be seeking U.S. capital and expertise to fund its strategic and emerging industries, to strengthen China's capital markets, and to position Chinese firms as global leaders and competitors. U.S. investors are funding some companies that are tied to the Chinese government's dual-use industrial policies, such as Made in China 2025. Similarly, China is investing in some U.S. firms that have technologies and capabilities that the government is seeking to advance its goals. While these investments may promote economic growth, offer strong returns for some U.S. investors, and provide financing for certain firms, at the same time, they also may develop competitive Chinese capabilities. Fourth, the role of the state in China's economy and business ecosystem has increased dramatically since 2014 under China's leader, Xi Jinping. This is intensifying the potential challenges and risks in financial and commercial ties with China for U.S. companies, U.S. investors, and the United States more broadly. A significant increase in two-way financial investment could give the Chinese government greater influence over U.S. companies, as well as the U.S. and global marketplace. Fifth, the corporate structures that Chinese firms are using to expand overseas and invest in U.S. capital markets, such as the Variable Interest Entity, or VIE, are complex. These structures appear to make it difficult for U.S. investors to assess potential risks. While U.S. underwriters, accountants, or legal counsel may have insights into these risks, they may not share this knowledge fully with U.S. investors who ultimately bear the costs of these risks. These complex corporate structures also separate the underlying Chinese company and its operations and assets from U.S. investors. This potentially limits the ability of U.S. investors to exercise their rights, including the right to seek full legal recourse if necessary. In closing, I'd like to discuss non-public transactions. There appears to be a lack of transparency on deals and an absence of publicly available data on the main and growing two-way investment pathways, which include private equity, venture capital, and private placements. This situation is complicated by U.S. and Chinese monies that appear to be increasingly commingled through funds that operate in the United States and China. Without greater transparency, it is difficult to assess how some financial transactions may support related deals that could involve the transfer of technology or know-how. Transparency gaps also potentially affect the U.S. government's ability to assess aggregate U.S. financial and economic exposure to China and potential risks. Thank you for your consideration. I look forward to your questions.
Ms. Ross.
Thank you, Chair Sherman, Ranking Member Huizenga, Chair Waters, and members of the subcommittee. I'm pleased to appear before you today to discuss the significant risks investors face from China-based companies that benefit from access to U.S. markets, but do not comply with the important investor protections under U.S. law. My testimony is based on my experience over 18 years serving in the Division of Enforcement at the SEC, where I gained firsthand knowledge of fraudulent accounting practices by foreign private issuers, and at the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, where I helped design audit oversight rules and initiatives that laid a framework to protect investors in foreign companies that issue securities in U.S. markets. The PCAOB's job is to oversee and inspect the auditors of companies that access U.S. public capital markets. 840 non-U.S. accounting firms from more than 80 jurisdictions are registered with the PCAOB in order to be able to prepare or participate in the preparation of audit reports provided to U.S. investors and submitted to the SEC. Not all of these firms actually do so, though, but when they do, the PCAOB is required to inspect their work to ensure that their audits comply with our standards. Both independently and through numerous cooperative agreements with local authorities, the PCAOB is able to inspect firms in all relevant jurisdictions except mainland China and Hong Kong. The PRC's resistance to the PCAOB's inspections is not just a theoretical compliance issue. Our markets are being tested by a string of frauds by China-based companies that obtained capital from our markets but failed to comply with our investor protection rules. By enacting the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act and continuing vigilant monitoring through hearings such as this one, Congress is playing a critical role in signaling that companies that seek access to capital from U.S. markets must adhere to our rules. I also commend the SEC and the PCAOB for the decisive approach they're taking to implement the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act. A great body of research documents the benefits that foreign private issuers obtain by issuing securities in the United States. Those benefits include a lower cost of capital than they would face in their home country capital markets. The linchpin of these benefits is the binding commitment companies make to our standards, including high-quality financial reporting requirements and a reliable third-party audit. Enforcement of this commitment, rather than relying on mere assertions of compliance, is what distinguishes U.S. listings and produces their capital market benefits. PCAOB inspections are a critical component of our enforcement regime. Inspections examine whether third-party auditors are in fact holding companies to their commitments to produce high-quality and reliable financial reports. There is empirical evidence that capital markets find financial reporting more credible following introduction of PCAOB inspections in non-U.S. jurisdictions. That is, investors put more faith in financial reporting when the PCAOB is able to inspect. China-based companies free riding on U.S. markets without complying with U.S. audit regulations increases fraud risks for investors in those companies. But that's not the only reason why it's important to stop the free riding. It also harms our markets more broadly. The benefits I've described exist because participation in our markets means something. It's a signal of the quality and reliability of the financial reporting of the companies that list here. As we saw in the days of the Enron scandal, when any group of participants fails to comply with our standards, that sends a signal that weakens confidence in the whole market. For the benefits to continue to flow to compliant U.S. and non-U.S. companies, it must be clear that we enforce our standards across the board. In conclusion, audit regulators around the world cooperate in PCAOB inspections of registered firms' audits of companies that offer securities in the U.S. The PRC is the only government that blocks them. This causes serious harm to both investors in such companies as well as our public capital markets more broadly. I commend the work you've done to put an end to these harms, as well as the work the SEC and PCAOB have done to implement the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act. Based on the heightened risks evident from a string of frauds that have already been revealed, it will also be important to ensure that China-based companies that are prohibited from trading on our public markets do not turn to other ways to access U.S. capital, and therefore I commend your continued vigilance. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony, Ms. Hsu.
Chairman Sherman, Ranking Member Huizenga, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. I'm a senior analyst at RWR Advisory Group, a research and advisory firm based here in DC, where I specialize in the geopolitical and national security risk implications of China's commercial activity and overseas engagement. I've been asked to provide some context on the nature of Chinese corporate actors and their role in China's state-led economy. I will also lay out several risks to investors in the United States, followed by recommendations. The Communist Party of China's involvement, influence, and control over the commercial sector means that Chinese companies are beholden to the party state and can be compelled to sacrifice corporate interests for government favor. Corporate actors are directed to meet state planning targets, and CCP officials are embedded within the operations of large companies to ensure regulatory compliance. The government has essentially the power to determine whether a company is allowed to raise capital, provide goods and services, or even continue to operate as a for-profit enterprise. There are clear incentives for companies to welcome CCP guidance and to operate in ways that are conducive to the state's interests. Companies can also be subjected to coercive and arbitrary punishment for crossing state lines. The heavy-handed and reactive nature of the Chinese regulatory apparatus can sometimes undermine its own companies, and by extension, American investors in those very companies. China's recent regulatory broadside has left the U.S. financial industry grappling with the challenge of quantifying the effect of government corporate intervention. This kind of uncertainty has a material adverse impact on companies and investors who cannot be sure if IPOs will go ahead or if entire industries will be banned from raising funds in the capital markets. What really amplified the impact of this latest spate of regulatory action and made it front-page news was a high level of global financial exposure to the stocks of those affected companies. The Chinese government prioritizes state stability and social control over commercial gains. The more intertwined the U.S. and Chinese markets become, the more acutely U.S. investors will feel the aftershocks of Beijing's politically driven market interventions. The U.S. commitment to high-quality, reliable disclosures and financial reporting is a key element of its ability to protect investors and market participants. The Chinese party-state sweeping bureaucratic authority, opaque legal system, and complex corporate structures obscure, often intentionally, Chinese companies' beneficial ownership and financial realities. Beijing also uses lack of transparency as an economic advantage, creating information asymmetries to control and moderate foreign flows into the Chinese market. These China-specific risk factors make it particularly challenging for U.S. regulatory authorities to conduct proper due diligence and can prevent U.S. investors from being able to make informed investment decisions. Variable interest entities, for example, are legally ambiguous corporate structures used by Chinese companies to list in the U.S. exchanges. VIE shareholders have no recourse to the operating company's underlying assets, and the moral hazard risks are substantial. Chinese companies seeking to issue unregistered securities in the United States are able to circumvent strict standards by taking advantage of the SEC's safe harbors like Regulation S and Rule 144A. With the rapid inclusion of China A shares into major stock indices, the expansion of Stock Connect schemes, and the quadrupling of A-share weighting in certain benchmarks, U.S. investor access to the publicly traded Chinese companies has expanded dramatically over the past few years. Index providers like MSCI and FTSE Russell have become a power force, serving as intermediaries and gatekeepers between Chinese companies and U.S. markets, exercising virtually unchecked, unregulated authority over the volume of U.S. capital flows to China. The criteria evaluated by index providers to support inclusion and weighting decisions are limited to standardized attributes, like market cap and liquidity, and neglect to consider the reputational and China-specific factors like state-sanctioned human rights abuses or financial exposure to party-state policymaking. U.S. retail and institutional investors are consequently exposed to a wide range of Chinese companies engaged in activities that are contrary to the national security and foreign policy interests of the United States. Many are already sanctioned by the U.S., but not subject to any capital markets sanctions, no investment restrictions or divestment mandates, and are thus able to continue raising capital in the U.S. markets. The current U.S. securities regulatory framework will need to evolve with greater, more targeted oversight, disclosure enforcement, China-specific due diligence, and sanctions alignment to respond in kind to the unique risks associated with this influx of securities listed overseas in institutional environments where the disclosure requirements and corporate governance practices don't offer the same protections for investors as in the U.S. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Lorber.
Chairman Sherman, Ranking Member Huizenga, distinguished members of the committee. I am honored to appear before you today to discuss the risks to investors and the United States posed by Chinese issuers in U.S. markets. I come before this committee as a sanctions and compliance professional, having worked at the U.S. Department of the Treasury and advised financial institutions, corporations, humanitarian organizations, and individuals on ensuring they operate in compliance with their legal sanctions obligations. As part of my work in both the public and the private sectors, I have seen firsthand the power of U.S. economic sanctions in furthering U.S. foreign policy objectives. And while sanctions are not a panacea, they can be used in narrow and targeted ways to great effect. One area where the United States has increasingly used this tool is in the global competition with China. As Congress and the Biden administration consider ways to protect U.S. markets from abuse and push back against certain Chinese activities that threaten U.S. national security, sanctions remain one of the top policy levers to consider pulling. Safeguarding transparency in the global financial system and in U.S. markets is critical to protecting U.S. national security and the strength of the U.S. financial system. A core part of providing this transparency is ensuring U.S. investors have access to relevant, material information about foreign companies in order to make informed decisions. Over the last few years, the United States has taken important steps to ensure that Chinese companies attempting to access U.S. markets must play by the same rules as U.S. companies and do not produce significant material risk in U.S. investors' portfolios due to their lack of financial transparency. At the same time, we must balance those considerations against the risk of creating an onerous set of disclosure requirements that deter companies from seeking to access U.S. markets or that make it overly burdensome to do business here in the United States. Such burdens can deter legitimate companies from seeking financing on U.S. capital markets. This is a delicate balance to strike. As Congress and the administration weigh whether to create new reporting and disclosure requirements and determine how to best protect U.S. investors, they should likewise consider the use of narrowly targeted sanctions, which offer a well-established tool to ensure U.S. companies and U.S. national security are protected from certain threats. The United States has a range of sanctions tools to target specific Chinese companies whose activity it believes poses national security risks. In particular, over the last few years, the United States has deployed limited but powerful prohibitions on trading in public securities of certain Chinese companies allegedly associated with the People's Liberation Army or otherwise alleged to be involved in China's civil military fusion program. Likewise, for companies or individuals who are alleged to engage in particularly egregious actions, this targeted approach may be a narrow and effective way to limit these companies or persons' access to U.S. markets and to U.S. capital more broadly. In addition to sanctions designations, the U.S. Department of the Treasury also has effectively promulgated advisories and guidance warning the private sector of doing business with certain companies or in certain sectors, including in Chinese industries. For example, the Treasury Department, along with its interagency partners, issued a supply chain advisory designed to warn the private sector about the risk of human rights abuses and forced labor in Xinjiang. These tools could provide a narrow, targeted way to warn U.S. companies and investors of the risks of doing business with certain Chinese companies or in particular industries, as well as limit the ability of those Chinese companies that threaten U.S. national security from securing capital on U.S. markets. I look forward to your questions, and thank you again for the opportunity to testify.
I want to thank all their witnesses for their testimony. I now recognize the chair of the full committee for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Sutter, it is reported that many China-based companies desire to be listed on the U.S. stock exchanges, not only because our markets are large and liquid, but because our stock exchanges permit initial public offerings or IPOs with something called dual-class share structures. Dual-class structures allow elite shareholders, most often company founders and executives, to have disproportionately large portion of the company voting power. This structure has been used by many companies from mainland China. In fact, at least 5 of the top 10 U.S.-listed China-based companies have dual-class structures. What I find interesting is that China's own exchanges, or the London Stock Exchange, for example, ban the practice of dual-class structures for IPOs. Ms. Sutter, how does the dual-class share structure permitted by our stock exchanges create risk to our investors? Why do China-based companies make use of this structure? Should our exchanges limit China-based companies' ability to offer dual-class share structures? And I find this situation very interesting. And I question whether or not we can question China when we use the same structures. And if we're questioning them because, as I'm told, China has more control over these big business, these owners, these top business people, and they direct them and they can tell them what to do, and somehow that's a difference between what they do and what we do. Can you help me out with this discussion?
Sure. Chairwoman Waters, thank you very much for the question. I think that with the dual class share issue, generally, there are broader considerations that I do not focus on. I'll narrow in on the China element in particular. As you mentioned, the Chinese companies do take advantage, they do use the dual class share structure. This has also become a competitive issue within China. So since 2018, the Hong Kong exchange, and then starting in 2019, the China exchanges have started to consider and adopt this dual structure. The one thing I would highlight in considering how the Chinese companies may use this structure is that in addition to this legal element, this formal element of dual-class shares, that within the Chinese system itself, not all shareholders are equal. And so I would highlight to you, in looking at the government restructuring of companies like the property developer Evergrande, the restructuring of companies like H&A Group, at the end of the day, the government is also often a shareholder or has a direct economic interest in a lot of these companies. It does not always play a kind of a disinterested role, shall we say. And so I think it's important that even if the dual-class share issue were to be resolved, that underlying this structure are these inherent asymmetries in the role of the state in a lot of Chinese companies. In the case of H&A, basically what they determined is although there were 300 or more subsidiaries that had been created for the company, at the end the Chinese government was the actual controlling shareholder.
Do you think that dual-class share structures are good, basically for us, as opposed to China, and that we should support what we do because somehow it advantages our economy in some way, or it advantages the way that we treat investors? Do you think it's good?
I don't have a specific opinion on the structure itself. I think the main point I would emphasize is that in addition to the formal structure, there is an informal structure in Chinese companies that regardless of how they list, this influence of the state and actual controlling shareholders and ultimate beneficiaries is embedded within the corporate system, either formally or informally, separate from even how they list in China or then how they might list on a foreign market such as the United States.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to yield back my time, but I think this is an issue that needs a lot more discussion. I yield back.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I now recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I get into my time, I do have a parliamentary inquiry. It is the minority's belief that the inclusion of this list that your staff had sent over to us of 3 bills that do not even have bill numbers at this point actually don't qualify as congressional testimony. It's not properly notified for us, and frankly, even more important, not properly notified to the public and those affected by that. So I guess, would just note that that these bills were not properly notified because at least at this point, it looks like they don't even have bill numbers. And do you then intend to have an actual hearing on these bills?
It is a practice of the committee to circulate discussion drafts. Of course, discussion drafts do not have bill numbers. Some of the most important legislation, I believe, has been discussed as drafts without HR numbers. Discussion drafts of bills at today's hearings do satisfy the McGovern rule, which requires that a bill has a legislative hearing before it goes to the floor. That being said, it's my expectation that either the full committee or more likely the subcommittee will have a more general hearing on capital markets issues, which will provide a second opportunity to discuss these bills before they go to the floor.
Furthering my parliamentary inquiry, I mean, the rules do state a 3-day notice. That was not what has happened, and just so we're clear and all on the same page with that. So at this point, I guess I'd like to, unless you have something more to add to that on the parliamentary inquiry, I'm happy to take my time for the questioning now.
You're recognized.
All right, thank you. Mr. Lorber and others, you've made some interesting notes on what's been happening with China. Obviously, we've seen large tech companies like Didi and Ant Group, Chinese companies that either have or were planning to go public in the U.S. Have been targeted by Beijing. It's clear that China believes it's ready to directly compete with U.S. markets for the title of premier global economy. What I'm curious about is your take on this is how serious is the CCP at all on this crackdown, and are we looking at kind of a financial version of Tiananmen Square here with their entrepreneurs and their They're folks that have been innovative, and along those lines, what can we do here in the U.S. to improve the market situation to make sure that we are competitive? I don't want to be Gulliver among the Lilliputians with a whole bunch of other people that have terrible policy, and we have slightly better policy. I want to have the gold standard, the U.S. dollar gold standard of policy here in the U.S. to make sure that we are the leading economic force.
Thank you, Ranking Member. I agree with your assessment and the assessment of other members of this panel when they suggest that you have seen a tightening of control over certain companies within China, and it appears to be led in part by the government or in full by the government. But I want to focus on the second part of your question because I think that's exactly right. I mean, ensuring that the U.S. capital markets space remains robust has all types of downstream positive economic impacts for the United States. It increases innovation. It ensures that the cost of borrowing here in the United States is low. It incentivizes non-U.S. companies to come and work in the United States. And so I think from sort of a perspective of ensuring that the U.S. financial system remains strong, trying to keep our financial markets as streamlined and as attractive as possible is an incredibly important goal.
So I'm curious, and along those lines, do increased mandatory SEC disclosures not related to financial or investment risk? This has been a significant part of our conversation on the subcommittee, and there was one of those that is proposed here today that applies to all U.S. listed companies, not just those from China. What does that do to encourage U.S. economic growth, or does it discourage it?
It's a good question. I do think that there's a risk of, if requiring non-material disclosures, that the burdens and the obligations that are imposed on U.S. and non-U.S. issuers will certainly create some degree of additional compliance obligations and some degree of deterrence for companies seeking to find financing on U.S. markets. So I do think that there is a risk in particular of requiring, again, disclosure related to non-material information.
Ms. Ross, you in your introductory materials and in biography and those types of things, you talk about materiality of disclosure. I'm curious if you could very quickly touch on that as well. In your mic.
Thank you so much, Member Huizenga. Yes, I mean, I agree with respect to these issues with China. It's really not a matter of needing more, new disclosures. The problem is that these China-based companies are not even complying with our existing rules. So adding new disclosures, I don't think will address it. I think what we need to do is actually enforce the existing rules and send the signal to the Chinese companies and the Chinese government that these are rules that pertain to our markets that they must adhere to when they're in our markets.
What about a targeted sanction or a something along those to address the Uyghur situation? Would you view that more effective versus a blanket sort of SEC? Real quickly, if you want to answer it, then I want to get to Mr. Lorber.
Yeah, sure. I agree with Mr. Lorber's testimony about the targeted sanctions can be very effective tools. I also think when we're talking about these China-based companies that are listed in the U.S. markets, across the board, they're not complying with our rules. So I do think across the board, enforcement of our rules against all of them is appropriate.
Enforcement, real quickly, your last seconds.
Yeah, I agree with the assessment of sanctions. I mean, I think you saw, particularly in the Xinjiang region, you saw the designation in 2020, I believe, of the XPCC, the Chinese paramilitary organization that was involved or alleged to be involved in those activities, as well as the publishing of guidance to warn about the supply chain. And I think that had a major impact on sourcing of goods in particular from that area.
My time has expired, but I just do want to commend the chair. I'm glad we're having this conversation. This is a conversation we need to have. We've had it in the past, but I think this has become more crystal clear, the seriousness of this issue for everyone, and I'm encouraged to have this ongoing conversation. I yield back.
The gentleman has gone over time, but if he wishes more time to praise the chair, he will be yielded it.
The gentleman is obviously a good-looking, wealthy, serious-minded person who is. Keep going? Okay. I think I will.
The gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Sutter, I want to pick up on your comment about selective access, because this is one way in which China has so much power here in the United States. I represent the movie industry in my district, and so they only allow 40 movies into China. If you run a studio, you want to be one of those 40. You know, if you make a movie about Tibet, that movie isn't getting into China. You know, if you make a movie about Tibet, none of your movies are getting into China. If you're Morgan Stanley and you want to do banking in China, you know that you may be one of the banks that gets into China. If your global index includes Chinese companies to a sufficient degree, and if you officially notify all your customers that they should include China to the 15% level or whatever level in their portfolios. You know that you'll be allowed to do business in China if your lobbyist is here on the Hill lobbying for China. China doesn't need to hire a lobbyist. They have all of them through this selective access system. I want to thank Ms. Ross for focusing on the importance of the already passed Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act and the need for us to pass the officially, definitely, explicitly noticed Accelerating Holding Foreign Companies Accountability Act bill that is pending before this committee, and point out that the original bill passed the Senate in light of Luck and Coffee, and that it was so, and people wonder, is there a benefit to short selling? There is at least one, and that is short sellers, in this case, Muddy Waters LLC, that focused on Luck and Coffee. They, for their discovered the problem there, that there was $300 million of fraudulent sales. They brought that to their attention. They, of course, made money by discovering that, and that short selling can be a way to discover those issues. Ms. Chu, I want to thank you for pointing out to us clearly that when you invest, we in the United States, we grow up with this, you buy a share in a company that owns assets. Those assets are managed in the interests of shareholders by a board of directors loyal to shareholders, and those assets are controlled by the corporation and their property interests are protected by the courts. That's 300 years, 400 years of common law. We just assume that. Oh, that's what a corporate share is. Whereas in China, the board may or may not be loyal to shareholders, may be more loyal to the goals of the Chinese Communist Party, and the courts may or may not enforce the property rights of the corporation vis-a-vis expropriation or arbitrary punishment or seizure. And yet I don't think Americans they just look at earnings per share and say, oh, that company's doing well, must be a good investment. Ms. Sutter, I want to focus on including VIEs in indexes and the deceptive name. If I wanted to raise some money, I'd call my company GameStop. I'd add an ED. It's a hot company. A lot of people like GameStop. You can call a company Alibaba of Cayman Islands and register shares here, and everybody thinks that's Alibaba of China. You don't own, but what you're really buying is a Cayman Islands company that owns a Chinese company that has some sort of contractual relationship with Alibaba. Everybody in China, everybody has a contract with Alibaba. That's, if you got them on your phone. Should we allow these phony names? Should we allow people to use the name Alibaba if they're not Alibaba? And should we allow people to say that you're in an index because you're a big company when you're really just a Cayman Island shell?
Thank you for the question. Would you like me to answer?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, just so to be sure. It's interesting when you read a Chinese company disclosure that's submitted to the SEC, they often will talk about the VIE structure and risks associated with the VIE structure, sometimes going on for 5 or 10 pages. It's an interesting question about, is Baidu Inc. Baidu, or is China Mobile Inc. China Mobile, in the sense of how the company is advertising to investors? So that's an interesting question to consider. I think, the other thing.
I'm going to have to ask you to respond for the record. It's my fault, but I've got to go on to the next questioner. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Missouri.
Hi, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And on that point, I think maybe that's why we have copyright laws, and perhaps it's up to the private entity and the company to exercise their copyright laws. Mr. Chairman, I think today's hearing topic is extremely timely and necessary. America faces continued health challenges and an economic crisis that was brought on by the Chinese government, suppressing, misrepresenting, and falsifying information concerning the spread of COVID-19 during the beginning of 2020. We must hold China accountable for their actions, which is why I've introduced the H.R. 3882, the Compensation for Americans Act. I also have authored an essay with Representative Andy Barr, who I know will be speaking on this topic later on, that outlines the need to strengthen U.S. sanctions regime, which is a key tool to denying our adversaries the resources they need to continue their illicit behavior. The increased mandatory risk disclosures being discussed today will not change China's behavior. Instead, we should be focusing on how to better use a more targeted tool, such as sanctions or export controls. Mr. Lorber, America's ability to counter China's global dominance is only effective if we focus on our strengths and leverage America's economic might to counter malign Chinese activities. As has been discussed today, using our securities disclosures to advance foreign policy goals can be counterproductive. Specifically, I think adding excessive reporting and compliance burdens not based on information that is material to investors' investment risk calculus typically undercuts companies' ability to expand, innovate, and generate jobs. Will you describe, sir, how the use of U.S. investment disclosures rules to accomplish certain policy goals compromises the strength and credibility of America's capital markets?
Thank you for the question, Representative Wagner. It's a good one. I mean, I think to a certain extent, if there are additional non-material reporting requirements put into place for companies, it will, as I mentioned earlier in the conversation, potentially reduce companies' willingness to list, companies that we want to list on U.S. financial markets or to access U.S. financial markets to seek that access. So I do think there can be a direct impact on the competitiveness of those markets if there are non-material reporting requirements and obligations that are put into place.
Will you comment, sir, also on why the strength of the U.S. economy and our capital markets is key to our effectiveness abroad?
Absolutely. So as we were talking about earlier, and I believe as Ms. Ross mentioned in her testimony, U.S. capital markets are something of a crown jewel of the U.S. economy, right? They allow for low-cost capital to be accessed. They are attractive for companies that are abroad. They increase innovation here in the United States. They bolster our economy here. And so I think that to a certain extent, especially when viewed vis-a-vis the sort of control that the Chinese government is now exercising over its companies and some of the crackdowns that we've seen, those markets are increasingly attractive, and I think we should do everything we can to bolster them.
Mr. Lorber, the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act was enacted last year because the Chinese government has actively not allowed Chinese companies listed on U.S. exchanges to comply with our securities laws. Is it just naive to think that Chinese companies will comply with the Democrats' mandatory SEC disclosure discussion drafts proposed today?
I do think that additional disclosure requirements may not be impactful in compelling Chinese companies to comply. I mean, that's why with the Holding Foreign Companies Accountability Act, the 3-year cutoff enforcement mechanism, I think, is an appropriate mechanism. And for those companies that the U.S. believes pose serious national securities threats, so maybe not just misleading on their financials, but actually are involved in, for example, the Chinese civil military program, their targeted security sanctions, I think, would make sense for policymakers to.
In my limited time, how do other tools like sanctions and export controls eliminate the question of whether or not our rules will be, in fact, followed by the Chinese Communist Party?
It's a great question. I mean, I think sanctions are a natural tool that have been employed by both of the last 2 administrations, the Trump administration and the Biden administration, to target companies that the U.S. government believes pose a national security threat. And in addition to that, the one other thing I would say is guidance. Treasury and other interagency partners have been really, really good in the last few years about putting out informative guidance to private sector actors to warn them of sanctions and illicit activity risks. And those companies that have read that guidance take into account that when making risk-based decisions.
Thank you, Mr. Lorber. My time's expired. I yield back.
We now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott, who is also chair of the House Agriculture Committee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman. This is an extraordinarily important hearing. China right now, its role in the global economy is just massive. China is the largest exporter of goods in the world, with 9.6% of the entire global share. And while the country's GDP grew at its lowest pace last quarter, expanding just 4.9% from the previous year, China's $15 trillion economy remains the second largest in the world. Second to us in the United States, ours is number 1. In your testimony, Ms. Sutter, you cite several factors regarding China's attempt to reduce debt and curtail market risks among several large firms. Here is the question for you that I think the nation and the world is waiting on. Can you explain what the impact would be for not just us, but all the global markets if a Chinese economic collapse were to occur?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. I think there's a lot of attention right now on the situation of China's second largest property developer, Evergrande. Their total debt is about 2% of China's national debt. I think it provides some insight into some overcapacity and China's continued dependence on fixed asset investment for growth, that this is a systemic weakness in the economy. A lot of people argue that right now, the U.S. potential risk exposure is manageable, but we're looking at a situation where a lot of financial firms now having new licenses to move into China. It's been discussed putting more Chinese companies into fund indices. What comes ahead? So I think Evergrande is a case study to look at the potential systemic risks in the market, how U.S. exposure could grow over time, and what would be U.S. recourse in these types of situations.
Let me ask you this. How exactly is the dramatic slowdown in Chinese construction projects and manufacturing, those two things, how are they related to the growing warning signs that we are getting of a possible shock to the global financial markets?
I would say in response, I think that the main thing to keep in mind is the trouble that Evergrande and other property developers have in China arguably was started by the Chinese government. These are highly leveraged companies. Evergrande's assets, 60% are unbuilt, unsold properties. And so these companies rely on money to continue to flow so that they continue to pay. So when the government stops the ability for new fundraising, it creates crisis in the system. So I think what you see the Chinese government doing now is trying to avoid market contagion in property, the market more broadly, but they're also trying to avoid moral hazard. They don't want to signal to companies like Evergrande that they can continue business as usual. The local government in China is very dependent on these property developers for income, for local government mandates. So there's a symbiotic relationship. In the case of Evergrande, the Shenzhen government is a direct shareholder in Evergrande. So these things, I think it's the interrelationship. It's a challenge for China to get out of this situation. And I would say the situation for the United States is less our current exposure. It's more about, we seem to be at a juncture where there's a lot of discussion about increasing financial exposure in areas like this in the economy. So what would that look like going forward? Most people seem to think the current exposure, if the Chinese are able to handle the situation, is fairly contained at this point, although that depends on how the Chinese government handles it going forward. It's an issues to watch type of scenario right now.
Thank you very much. Very good information. Thank you.
Thank you. We now recognize the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill.
I thank the chairman. Appreciate your work in preparation of this hearing. It's certainly a topic of interest, strong interest to members of both parties, and appreciate our witnesses' preparation and being here personally. It's good to see witnesses in person, Mr. Chairman, and not on a Zoom screen. So in the late 80s, I spent a lot of time traveling in Asia, including in China, and I can remember distinctly John Phelan's famous trip to Beijing in 1986, trumpeting the New York Stock Exchange as a potential place for Chinese companies to list. Americans had seen the success of the Asian tigers by the 80s, and I think the U.S. policymakers really believed that if we demonstrated and modeled good behavior and opened up our markets, capital markets, to China, that we would get a good response. And in fact, China's capital markets did grow. Access to capital was there. And there's no doubt that free markets and capitalism and the open trading system allowed China to create hundreds of millions of people and move them into the middle class. Certainly China has benefited from this past 3 decades. But that 30 years of progress from the open door has now seen that door slam shut since President Xi has turned his country into a more authoritarian state and turning his back on the norms in capital markets. Consumers are no longer benefiting, but they're now pawns in a surveillance state. The business sector is no longer benefiting as much because markets are volatile, rules are inconsistent, and the state demands full control of entrepreneurship. Investors, I don't know if they're benefiting or not. I think the purpose of this hearing is to demonstrate that maybe they're not, because they're not getting the kind of information that a good market like the American markets provides. The third world and emerging markets are not benefiting due to the predatory neo-colonial Belt and Road policies of China. And finally, their attitude about the capital markets would make the founders of Enron blush. So I want to say thank you to our ranking member and chair for calling this hearing. I want to start with Ms. Sutter. Excellent testimony. You provided a lot of good information to the committee. And on the VIE structure, and also even using an ADR structure, which we've done for years and years, successfully. In many markets, we've allowed liquidity for foreign companies. Tell me what you think we ought to do that's fair-minded, that's compliant with WTO obligations on improving disclosure for the use of a VIE or even the ADR structure.
Congressman, thank you for the question. There has been a lot of interest around the challenges that the United States faces with China, not just in this area, but across the board, and an interest in looking at greater transparency. A couple of ideas that I hear discussed that may be of interest for consideration for you and the committee. The issue of requiring a 20F or 10K equivalent for all firms, not just those who list, but those also who have secondary listings. The issue of more detail on the corporate structure, all the beneficial owners, all the different contracts and ties across the owners is another area that some have discussed. The issue of quarterly as opposed to only annual reports on a company's financial situation.
Let me interrupt you there. Do you think if that were the status, that would make America a less effective market, say, for American depository receipts? Or would you think, not just China, but as a general matter, would that be something that would be met with appropriately since companies want access to U.S. retail investors?
I would say that the issues I just raised, I believe, are the same for what a U.S. lister would have to do.
Right. Thank you for that.
Sure.
Now let me turn to Ms. Chu. You made, again, excellent presentation. You commented on SEC Commissioner Hester Pierce's speech where she was open to additional disclosure for index providers and ETFs, exchange-traded funds. Tell me what you would think would be appropriate there.
Thank you for the question. So at present, the criteria used by index providers who, again, exert overwhelming power over where U.S. investors are able to invest in China, which companies have access to U.S. capital, the criteria that they use is based on market factors. They have no considerations for reputational risks like human rights or national security, sanctions regimes, trade conflict, and these are all things that pertain.
Thank you. If you would submit for me your additional thoughts on that to the record. Mr. Chairman, I yield back to you.
The gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Himes, who's also chair of the longly named Subcommittee on National Security, International Development, and Monetary Policy, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and a big thank you to our witnesses for really compelling and interesting testimony. I want to use my 5 minutes to really zero in on the China issue here. Look, there's a long list of things that concern us all about China that have to do with strategy and geopolitics and military and IP theft, and it goes on and on and on. But this is the Financial Services Committee, and I'm not a priori persuaded that variable capital arrangements are inherently problematic. Lots of U.S. companies, as the chairwoman points out, use variable capital structures. We're hearing about Luckin Coffee. I had never heard of Luckin Coffee, but dodgy accounting leading to bankruptcy is hardly a uniquely Chinese problem. So I guess let me start with you, Ms. Ross, because you did enforcement. Is there an allegation? So if I'm wrong about that variable capital or particular intensity of bankrupt companies in China, I'd be interested to know. But I'm sensing that there is an allegation floating around that perhaps the Chinese are getting special treatment in the face of the sanction mechanisms that the markets already have. In other words, hundreds of companies are delisted every couple of years. Are the Chinese, a specific question is, are the Chinese somehow getting special treatment with respect to bad behavior not leading to delisting? And more generally speaking, what is the narrowly Chinese issue within capital markets, or are they more broad capital markets issues that we should be focused on?
Thank you for that question, Congressman Himes. So I think there is a uniquely Chinese issue here, which is that we have investor protections in this country that require inspections of audits of companies that are listed here. That's been, these protections are known to reap economic benefits, both for our markets, our investors, and the companies that are listed here. Almost all non-US companies that are listed here are subject to and cooperating with those protections, and the jurisdictions that they're in are cooperating in those protections. The PRC is the sole jurisdiction in the world that is blocking that investor protection. So in that respect, companies from mainland China and Hong Kong that are listed here are getting a different deal than all other companies, both in the U.S. and non-U.S. jurisdictions. That's what needs to be fixed, and that's why I commend your Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act.
And what's the right way to address that? I mean, you know, there are well-established pathways, SEC action, private rights of action, delisting. What's the right way to address that?
Right, so you've mentioned delisting. That's the pathway that is embodied in the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act. What you've done is put forward a very straightforward and orderly process for managing these companies if they don't come into compliance within the next 3 years. And if you enact the Accelerated Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act, that will be 2 years. You've given ample time for companies and for the Chinese government to understand what the pathway is, and we're already seeing investors and markets and even the Chinese government taking that seriously.
And what about the exchanges who ultimately would do the delisting? Are they particularly hesitant to take this up with Chinese issuers?
Well, in this case, it's actually the SEC would issue orders prohibiting trading in these companies, and that's a very standard procedure, as you've mentioned.
Okay, and so again, trying to get at the uniquely Chinese problem here, this is not an unusual action for the SEC. Is the SEC somehow, has it been hesitant to take this action with respect to Chinese companies, or should this committee be tightening up across the board SEC enforcement against failure to be sufficiently transparent?
Great question. So the SEC, these are traditional tools the SEC uses, which is why I think they're going to be very useful in this case. What's unique about this situation is that the PRC has resisted inspections of audits of all China-based companies that are listed here. That's a unique situation. But you've designed this act to take advantage of, long-standing, well-understood SEC processes to address it.
And just in my remaining moments, I was actually interested to learn that I guess the London Stock Exchange prohibits variable capital companies. Is that an idea that would have support amongst these witnesses for adoption here in the United States?
I do think there are risks associated with variable interest enterprises. I think that they are very opaque. I do not think that the average investor understands that when they're investing in a VIE, a listed company that's based on a VIE, they are not investing in the operating company that's based in China. They have no voting rights, and they have no rights to, no say over what management does, or no rights to information. That's very different from other, most U.S. listed companies, and I think that presents very big risks to investors.
Thank you. Thank you. My time's expired.
Gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson, is now recognized.
Thank the chairman. Thank our witnesses. Appreciate your testimony, written and oral. And Ms. Ross, I just want to say thanks for your dialogue there with Mr. Himes. I think you did a great job highlighting the specific problems where China really is getting a different set of rules and the disclosure regime, and hopefully how legislation passed here could change that and apply an even-handed set of policies that are already in the standard toolkit for the SEC. So I hope we see some real results towards that. So thank you for your dialogue. I'm concerned about Ofac. I mean, frankly, we've done a lot of sanctioning since 1975 when this law was applied. And I'm also concerned about China. And frankly, the conflation of market risk, which our committee dealt with and Ms. Ross highlighted really well, with policies that are really foreign policy, like, for example, the treatment of Uyghurs. And Mr. Lorber, I, in particular, just want to know, how effective has Ofac been at identifying and addressing national security risks, and is Ofac a more appropriate way to deal with China's human rights abuses than the Securities and Exchange Commission, for example?
Thank you, Representative Davison. It's a great question. I will say OFAC has been particularly effective, both generally but also specifically related to human rights. After the passage by Congress of the Global Magnitsky Act and the implementation of that act in December 2017, the Treasury Department and OFAC have targeted a wide range of human rights abusers and oftentimes caused them to lose hundreds of millions of dollars in assets. So there has been a real impact that OFAC has achieved with the use of human rights related sanctions. I do think that to your second question of whether or not OFAC should be, for example, the body that goes after human rights abusers versus something like the SEC, I do think OFAC has expertise, and the Treasury Department more generally has expertise. They have an intelligence collection function, for example, that allows them to identify and successfully target human rights abusers.
Yeah, thank you. And frankly, it's a national security problem dealt with by America's government, with the people with the toolkit and the intelligence to do it. And the passive approach is to say, well, these publicly traded companies are going to do it. That's what was done on conflict minerals, for example. And at the time, I remember one of the companies I had like 30 employees in it, and I'm filling out forms on conflict minerals when I buy steel. And I mean, a small business in Western Ohio isn't really in a position to assess the supply chain risks of steel mills. And so everyone just signs off on the form. It's a very passive approach versus a very active approach to diplomacy. And in general, that's been kind of the challenge, hasn't it? With China, America's been a little too passive. We've hoped for all these good things from China, but in spite of the facts that we see China's abuse of the World Trade Organization, for example, we haven't forced them to honor their existing commitments, and we haven't forced them to play by a standard set of rules. And that's what I love about the idea that if you want to stay listed, you have to be subject to our accounting policies just like anybody else. And if you want normal trade relations, you have to be compliant with human rights standards around the world. And I think it's long overdue that we apply that to China. Now, inside China, of course, China's concerned about their own domestic market, and they have lots of attention focused on Evergrande, for example. But we're watching a meltdown in China that may be similar to real estate meltdown in the United States. They had a massive boom. They've definitely inflated asset prices in many of their real estate markets, and Evergrande has been at the center of that. So, Ms. Sutter, I just wanted to maybe finish with you. Your testimony does an excellent job of laying out the developments surrounding Evergrande. As you state, about 60% of their assets are unbuilt and unsold properties, and the firm counts loan interest payments as assets. This has empowered Evergrande to become shockingly leveraged, and now Evergrande owns about $305 billion in debt, 2% of China's GDP. We've already seen developments where Evergrande has failed to repay some of its obligations. However, there hasn't been contagion effects we would expect when an entity of this size goes into default. Why do you believe that is? Is China actually subsidizing it directly, or do you anticipate things by the People's Bank of China to deal with it?
Congressman, thank you for your question. I think the government is directly involved in restructuring Evergrande. They've set up a committee, and it's very similar to what they've done with other companies that have gotten into financial trouble, Anbang, H&A, Fosun. And I think what they're trying to do is discipline the company while not having contagion in the broader markets, property market, and broader markets. And so I think that they're it's a little bit of push-pull.
Thank you. And if we can follow up in written, my time has expired, and I appreciate the chairman.
The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster, is also chair of our committee's task force on artificial intelligence, is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to our witnesses. You know, there are three functions of our capital markets: to allocate capital, to do so efficiently, and to control risk. And the opacity of Chinese financial products puts at risk all three functions. American capital markets are the premier venue for issuers due to our deep liquidity and broad investor base, both of which are substantially the products of the high information transparency established by our regulatory regime. Essentially, here more than anywhere else, you know what you're buying into. We must uphold these standards, and there should be consequences for not complying with the transparency measures, which is why I was a proud co-sponsor of Chair Sherman's Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act. and I look forward to further bipartisan action on this front. Now, when we take action, one key question is whether the U.S. should act unilaterally, bilaterally, or multilaterally. If we unilaterally start delisting China-based companies, per the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act implementation, do we risk triggering a regulatory race to the bottom, where the delisted companies would just say, relist in, London, Germany, Singapore, Hong Kong, or even dodgier locations? Or are we better off acting multilaterally? Very much like President Biden's recent successful negotiation of global minimum corporate tax rates. And so my question, I guess, to all of our witnesses, is there any significant discussion of multilateral agreements on minimum transparency standards for listed companies? And if so, what are the venues in which these are discussed, at least among the free democracies of the world? Just happen to go down the line, anyone? Ms. Sutter, you want to take a swing? Or whoever. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you, Congressman, for the question. There is competition among exchanges, and that is a consideration about when one market takes moves, how companies shift potentially to another. I would mention that under China's leader Xi Jinping, there's been a big push for Chinese companies to come home, to list either on Hong Kong, in China, either as their only listing or as a dual listing. One issue for consideration could be to look at U.S. standards with like-minded, open, transparent markets that lean on the rule of law in the sense that we do, and to compare those standards.
So my question is, what are the venues at which those might be discussed or could be being discussed now? Are there groups that are looking into this sort of thing? Ms. Ross, did you want to?
I agree with Ms. Sutter's characterization or description of this situation, particularly in China, that the Chinese government is actually pulling the companies home. But to your question, Congressman, the SEC is a very active member in the International Organization of Securities Regulators, known as IOSCO. IOSCO includes almost all major securities regulators around the world and has many committees that develop all kinds of model rules, model legislation, share information. That's proven to be a very proactive and successful forum to raise standards across the board and address some of these risks that you're talking about like, for example, race to the bottom.
Yeah, is China a member of this? And what would be their reaction if we raise standards, that would effectively delist their companies in the U.S.? Would they insist on letting those lower standards still apply in China?
None of the members of IOSCO are obligated to follow the requirements of IOSCO. IOSCO is really a body to share and develop best practices, and the members, then
they pick and choose, right?
They pick and choose, but it's still a very good forum to
discuss. And so there would have to be a separate new group that says, okay, we are all going to agree to, to common standards, to avoid this sort of regulatory race to the bottom.
If you wanted to do that, yes.
Yeah, Ms. Chu.
And I'd just like to jump in to note that the EU recently enacted a regulatory framework for index providers. I think that's the first time they've done anything of the sort, and I would encourage the United States to consider enacting similar legislation, similar regulatory policy, or to seek out commonality.
Mr. Lorber, any comments? Or?
I don't have information on whether or not there's a multilateral body to prevent the sort of regulatory arbitrage that you're mentioning. I will say I do think at a high level, while obviously regulatory arbitrage of this nature would be a potential issue and a concern, there would be certain companies that I think pose national security risks that even if they were to say, we're going to go to another exchange, we would want to prevent them from accessing U.S. capital markets in any event.
All right, understood. My time is out. Yield back.
Mr. Hollingsworth is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, I'm excited to be here and appreciate all the testimony that's been given thus far throughout the course of this hearing. There's a lot of issues on the table, and in this constellation of issues before us, I wanted to break a few things apart and better understand both the aims which we are trying to accomplish and the means by which we might get there. It seems in my conversations with colleagues on my side of the aisle and colleagues across the aisle as well, that there are a couple different things that are being talked about. Number one, there's deep concern that China may be appropriating technology from U.S. private firms and certainly from U.S. government as well for use of its own design. Number two, there's some concern about protecting U.S. investors from Chinese companies that may list here, but in fact not be engaged in the business practices that they say they are, or not be audited in the manner in which we believe they should be. I think number three, there's some concerns that firms that might be gaining advantage of U.S. capital are deploying that in unethical ways, right? Uyghurs, for example. That probably isn't specific to China, but around the world, no matter where it may be and what its geography may be, that we would disapprove of. And I think fourth, there's this also lingering sense that's hard for me to shake that perhaps we are just out to deprive Chinese companies of U.S. capital, period, instead of U.S. technology. And I want to make sure that I understand all of those different aims so that the mechanisms by which we might accomplish that truly get us there. Mr. Lorber, I wanted to talk about one of those specifically with you, and that is the deprivation of technological transfer from U.S. firms to Chinese firms that we believe may be a threat to our national security, and the means by which we have currently in place, in law, to stop that. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question, Representative Hollingsworth, and I like your sort of framing and the bucket system that you've approached us with. On the first bucket, which is the concern that China may be appropriating technology and what we have in place to prevent that, I think there are a couple different mechanisms that exist. One is surely private causes of action. So this may not be a U.S. government approach, but there are lawsuits that can be filed. Likewise, there are criminal causes of action too the Department of Justice can pursue. Right. And part of this process during the last administration was undertaken with the Department of Justice's, I believe it was the China Espionage Unit, I think was the name of it, something akin to that. The second primary body that you can think about when it comes to technology theft would be, or concerns about technology appropriation could be in the context of CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, and of course this body's revision of CFIUS with the passage of FIRMA in 2018. Right. And then there could also be potential targeted sanctions that could be focused on particular Chinese companies if the administration decided to do so.
Is there a gap today that exists that we should solve for in the prevention of that important technology transfer?
I think, I'd have to go back and take a little bit of a deeper look at it. I think one of the concerns is that on the private cause of action front, there are challenges. I know there have been instances where Chinese companies that have been accused of IP theft have employed certain legal measures here in the United States, like the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, as a way to try to prevent private litigants from accessing it. And I know there's been a major debate about that over the last few years in the legal community.
But much of that work is ex post facto, right? The technology transfer has already occurred and they are trying to recoup their losses therefrom as a private enterprise or private persons, right? Much of our work up here is the prevention of that rather than the putting together of Humpty Dumpty. I wanted to better understand, is there any area that we need to do work from a legal standpoint in the prevention of technological transfer that threatens our national security?
Well, so I take your point that it's kind of an ex post thing, but I think that even if it's solved for ex post, it could have a deterrent impact moving forward. So for example, if companies are thinking about stealing US IP and they recognize that if they do so, there's a decent chance not only will they get sued, but that they'll lose.
Well, that only counts if that suit renders a judgment and that judgment is collected upon, right? Which is a real challenge.
100%.
Look, I think what I'm trying to make sure I understand is I don't believe that we should solve these problems in the financial sector, but I believe we should solve them with very vigorous laws that prevent this and real penalties in the event those laws are broken. Call the sheriff if someone is stealing. Don't call the local bank to try to prevent them from depositing it in their bank account. With that, I'll yield back.
Mr. Vargas is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have to say that I think today's hearing has been excellent. I agree with most of the things that have been said on both sides of the aisle. However, I also think that whenever we talk about China, there's a great disconnect between what we say and what we do. So, for example, I agree fully with everything that Mr. Hill said today, and Mr. Hill's a good friend, and I know he has great experience in this, and I think he's absolutely right that China has become very aggressive, become an authoritarian state, and they collect a whole lot of data that they shouldn't be. However, at the same time, I'm from California. I can tell you, we have ships way out of the ocean now waiting to be unloaded with all the Chinese product that come to the United States. We can't seem to buy enough. It's incredible that we say that they cheat, they do all these things. We have the great nation competition, yet at the same time, we don't seem to say that we're not going to buy all their stuff. We do, in fact, do that no matter whether they come here and they cheat or they treat Uyghurs terribly and abuse them and have horrible human rights issues and spy on all their people. It doesn't matter. We still buy their stuff. I try not to. I try very hard, but at the same time, it even drives me crazy that my iPhone is not manufactured there necessarily, but it is put together there. We say one thing and we do another when it comes to China. And I think we have to understand that they are not only competing with us, but they're becoming a real threat. And we have to do more than what we're doing. That's why I think it's very good that we're looking at them frankly and looking at them holistically and saying, wait a minute, first of all, okay, a lot of our companies, as Mr. Sherman said quite well, want to be in China because of the market there. I get that. In fact, if every time a movie seems to go there from the United States, they make more money in China than they do in the United States. So I get that. But at the same time, we have to understand that they're not only our competitor, they cheat. And when they want to access our capital markets, they don't want to play by our rules. We have to change the rules. We have to go after them. I think that that's a good thing. But at the same time, we don't seem to. We say that we will, but we won't. So I guess I would ask Ms. Ross, they don't play by our rules. What should we do?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. I couldn't agree with you more. When the PCAOB was first formed in 2003, the PCAOB, as I said in my testimony, the PCAOB undertook the task of reaching out to countries around the world who had foreign private issuers who were listed in our markets to work out arrangements so that we could make sure that the PCAOB could implement its own responsibilities in an appropriate way. And that's worked out. It's taken many years, but it's worked out in every single jurisdiction where we have US-listed foreign private issuers based in other countries. The sole outlier is the PRC. Mainland China and Hong Kong firms are not complying with our rules. We've had ample time, many, many years, to resolve these differences, and I think that the actions that the Congress has taken with the Holding Foreign Public Companies Accountable Act are critical to signaling that we've got to put a stop to that situation and enforce our rules across the board with all companies. So I think that was a very positive step that you took.
Well, thank you. And again, I just believe we have to get more aggressive and understand the situation that we're in now. Certainly, it's a terrible thing that we had the Cold War, but we understood we had to fight that at the end of the day, and we won. We're in a situation now with China when they're quite aggressive all around the world, and even militarily. Now, when they team up with Russia, they surround Japan militarily. I mean, they're doing things that are very belligerent, and we have to understand that, and we have to push back. I know that our companies want to be there. I know that they're a big player, but at the same time, we can't continue down this road and think things are going to be okay. So again, I appreciate what everyone has said today. I think that there's a great discussion going on, but I also think that there's a lot of things that we can do together here, because I think both sides see communist China somewhat the same, not completely. I think there's a lot we can do. And again, I thank the chairman, I thank the ranking member, and I see that I have 7 seconds, so I'll yield back. Thank you.
I thank my fellow Southern Californian, and I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Gonzalez.
Thank you,
Mr. And who I might add was the Republican lead on the Holding Foreign Companies Accountability Act.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman, and thank you for your leadership on that important issue. And thanks for this hearing and to our witnesses. I think this is a tremendously important topic that, frankly, we're going to be dealing with for a very long time. I want to start my questions with Ms. Chu. In this subcommittee, we often talk about how the U.S. capital markets are the envy of the world, and I think that's accurate. And there's a lot of reasons for that: the liquidity, the access to various different types of investors, et cetera. One argument we hear against cracking down on China in a meaningful way is that companies and investors will flee, that they'll go to other jurisdictions, and therefore we shouldn't do anything because we put at risk that incredible U.S. capital market structure. One, sort of how do you fall down on that? And then what sort of steps, if any, do you see China taking in order to replicate the U.S. markets and to try to keep Chinese companies from listing in the U.S.?
Thank you for the question. On the first point, with regard to Chinese companies fleeing the U.S. markets, of course, we've seen a couple of companies already leave. There are companies like, there are China's four AI dragons who are known for surveillance technology. I think at least 3 of the 4 were planning to IPO in the United States as of the end of last year, and after the entity list designations, have decided to either go to the Shanghai Starboard or to potentially the new Beijing exchange. So yes, that is a possibility, but at the same time, I believe that enforcing capital market sanctions and restrictions on investments is critical to U.S. foreign policy objectives. At the end of the day, incongruous policy is ineffective policy. So when you have a company that has been identified as, for example, building missiles in China or building hypersonic missiles, and we decided that U.S. companies are not allowed to supply them technology or services or knowledge, and then you're allowing the U.S. investors to invest in those same companies so they can build up those R&D capabilities, that is a significant flaw, and that is a significant gap in our ability to enforce any sort of policy goal.
Thank you. And I just to interrupt quickly, I couldn't agree more. I think there's sort of a question, which is, if somebody's on the entity list and they're clearly, the company's designed essentially to give China a competitive advantage militarily against the United States, should we really be that upset if they decide to list in Shanghai? My view is no, we should not. Thank you for that. Mr. Lorber, I want to switch to you. In your testimony, you mentioned targeted blocking sanctions against specific individuals. What's been the overall effectiveness in these situations where the U.S. has targeted specific people?
So obviously it depends on the target, but there have been many situations in which the targeted blocking sanctions that we've employed have been particularly impactful. So the example I mentioned earlier, the XPCC, the way that Ofac sanctions regulations work is that essentially if you target an entity, anything that entity owns 50% or more is also by law sanctioned. And in the context of the XPCC, it actually had, I think, hundreds of subsidiaries spread around the world that were all blocked. And so if there was U.S. jurisdiction, you couldn't do business with them. So it actually had a major impact on the entity.
Great. So definitely something to consider going forward. Ms. Chu, back to you. I want to talk about Didi and Chinese government's crackdown, ranging from their security overreach into the company and their efforts to exert more state control. Is this a sign of a new trend by China, and how do you see that trend playing out vis-a-vis the capital markets?
I would respond that these are not new trends necessarily. The Chinese government has always exercised its regulatory apparatus to crack down on social ills, crack down on companies posing threats to state control, and also to address problems that maybe have been festering to the surface under Chinese society for a long time and have just now come to a head, and they're forced to take brisk and just really strong action, maybe capricious action, to address them. What has happened is that U.S. investors are now exposed to these companies that are increasingly exposed and are therefore increasingly exposed to these regulatory risks and crackdowns.
Real quickly, do you think we need to do more from a disclosure standpoint to help U.S. investors understand when a Didi or another Chinese company is compromised in various ways as they come public in U.S. markets?
Yes, I think that's absolutely necessary. And beyond that, I do think that disclosure requirements would serve as a deterrence for Chinese companies that are involved in serious human rights abuses or national security problems. For example, in the Hong Kong Stock Exchange in, I think, 2015, China Communications Construction Company's dredging entity sought to IPO. When they were asked at that point if they were involved in South China Sea militarization activities, after a period of time, they postponed. I think they ultimately withdrew their IPO application because in the Communist Party of China's party state, you can't disclose and you're not supposed to acknowledge that these are risks.
Thank you, Ms. Chu. I'll follow up directly, and I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize the gentleman from Illinois who has received so many honors in his life, none more important than being vice chair of this very subcommittee.
Nothing prouder than being under your leadership, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much, and thanks to all our witnesses. Ms. Sutter, I want to start with you and just pick up on some things that you had mentioned about Evergrande, if I'm pronouncing that right. You know, the headlines, and I think you've said this, you know, they're $300 billion of debt potentially at default, 2% of China's GDP, 2% of their debt as well, national debt. Real estate exposure, maybe 30% of Chinese markets, and if I'm doing the math right, 190 Chinese-based companies, 2.4 trillion of market cap, so maybe 10% of the NYSE, New York Stock Exchange, exposed there. That may, I don't want to be over, maybe that's too much. What do you think is the systemic risk to financial markets we should be thinking about if Evergrande were to default on their $300 billion? Are those about the right metrics? Are we thinking about possibly 10% of the U.S. stock market exposed? Is it bigger? Is it smaller? How do you think about the systemic risk there?
Thank you for the question. I have not done the math on the stock exposure, but I think that you know, to me, the important issue that it raises is kind of what it shows about how the Chinese government gets involved when a company is in trouble, because it shows what are the rights of investors vis-a-vis the Chinese state when you have exposure to a Chinese company.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, you know, as I mentioned earlier, right now the parameters of exposure seem somewhat manageable, but there is an issue about who gets paid, in what priority order, how are you paid. You know, we've looked at this in China since the failure of the Guangdong Trust, GIDIC, in 1999, as far as just trying to preference domestic or international investors. And I think, to me, it highlights something to watch about how the government is a direct investor in Evergrande as much as it is a regulator of Evergrande.
So let me, I want to sort of put this somewhat more qualitative version of the question to you, Ms. Ross. In the absence of our ability for the PCAOB to go in and audit the auditors, how confident are you of our ability to answer the fundamental question, whether for Evergrande or someone else, what is our systemic exposure in the U.S. economy to situations like Ms. Sutter described, the specific case of Evergrande? How confident are you? What are the air bars around that in your view?
Thank you for that question, Congressman Kasten. It's a very important question. Our understanding of systemic risk comes largely from our access to information so that we can analyze those risks. That's what Ms. Chu does every day in trying to access the information. But we, when companies list in our public markets, we depend on those disclosures to understand the risk. And then on a whole basis of all the companies from a particular jurisdiction or in a particular industry, we use the disclosures, investors use the disclosures, markets use the disclosures to assess the systemic risk.
Okay.
We can't fully do that without compliance, and that's why it's so important that we be able to enforce our accounting and auditing rules.
Okay, and I'm sorry to cut you off, but I want to get to a question with enough time to answer it. We've talked a lot about the Holding Foreign Company Accountable Act as being, you know, targeted at China, but I think it's important for us to be clear that it doesn't actually say China. It says if the PCAOB can't go in and audit the auditors for 3 years, they have to be delisted. And of course, you're nodding, this only applies right now to China, right? But in theory, if another country decided to do that, but right now we're just limited to that exposure in China. So here's my question that I'm building to. I want to make sure we're not playing whack-a-mole, right? Let's say that all the provisions of the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act get implemented. All the good ideas that both sides of the aisle have run up here have addressed. It seems to me we still have this huge gap because all of these rules don't apply when we get to to get into these questions of exempt offerings, right? Because if a company is going to list under one of these exempt offerings, all of a sudden all these other rules about SEC disclosure and what have you don't get there. So how should we be thinking about, because if we address this all for sort of conventional old-timey offerings, and China still wants to do all the things we're talking about doing that they do in these hearings, don't they just have a back door to come in there through these exempt offerings?
Absolutely, I agree with your line of thinking there. We not only have to protect our markets for public securities, but we also have to be concerned about if the companies are delisted, that they'll take advantage of our system of exempt offerings that allow companies to sell securities here to specific kinds of investors under different circumstances and not follow our normal disclosure rules.
And I'm out of time, but maybe just for the record afterwards, what I'd like to understand is how much of, if the Holding Foreign Company Accountable Act only applies to China, how much does that potential backdoor apply to a lot of countries beyond China that have a way to backdoor in through our exempt offerings rules? And would welcome your chance writing afterwards. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank the Vice Chair, and we now move on to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the testimony. One thing that I think we may want to get a more detailed taxonomy on, and Mr. Lorber, I'll start with you. What did the Trump administration do vis-a-vis China, like in terms of securities, China sanctions? There's been some mention of the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act, S-945, which he signed into law last year. What did the Trump administration do?
So the Trump administration on China did quite a bit when it came to sanctions. In terms of securities and publicly traded securities, in November of 2020, the administration issued executive order, I think it was 13969, which essentially prohibited U.S. persons from trading in specific publicly traded securities of identified companies that were considered CCMC, Chinese Communist Military Companies, so an identified list of Chinese entities that the Trump administration determined posed a national security threat. In addition, there are a range of other sanctions that the Trump administration imposed related to Hong Kong, as I mentioned with the XPCC, related to activities in Xinjiang, and a host of other specific blocking sanctions and designations. But the one specific item which related directly to securities was that executive order. And then finally, in addition, the administration put out a range of guidance and advisories to warn U.S. companies of the sanctions and illicit finance-related risks that it assessed were emanating from China. In particular, there was, as I mentioned, a Xinjiang supply chain advisory that they put out among a series of others as well.
So one of the bills that showed up on my desk when I walked in here this morning was H.R. 2072, which deals with Xinjiang and the Uyghurs. What did the Trump administration do, last administration, specifically on this, and which company did they target?
So they designated the XPCC in, I think, it was July 2020. And the XPCC is, according to the Treasury Department, the paramilitary organization that runs many of the camps, the forced labor institutions within Xinjiang. And so, as I mentioned, when they designated them, that entity had hundreds of subsidiaries spread around the world. And so there was a major impact on companies that were sourcing product from Xinjiang to realize, well, we may not be able to source that product anymore because it could expose us to U.S. sanctions. And in addition to that, they also released the supply chain advisory to make clear to companies that were sourcing from that area that there were real sanctions and other risks associated.
Are we aware of other companies that should have been sanctioned that the Trump administration perhaps missed?
I'm not personally aware of others that were not sanctioned that the administration missed.
Any other witnesses? Ms. Hsu, do you want to?
Thank you. So the 13949 and I think 14032, the two bills that give legislative authority to the China Companies Sanctions Program, the lists under those, as well as the Department of Defense's 1260H section list, include a total of maybe 80-something individual unique companies that are designated as Chinese military companies. I've identified hundreds more. That includes subsidiaries and direct parents of these companies, many of which are directly involved in weapons programs and, high-tech surveillance, but also in just generally China's military modernization drive. That includes companies that are, building missiles, companies that are developing UAVs in the South China Sea that are directly countering U.S. forces. So yes, there are significant gap in the implementation of those sanctions, especially because the text, I think, of both suggested that they would be living, breathing documents updated regularly with new information. But neither of those lists, the annex of the recent executive order, nor the DoD 1260H list, have been updated since they were released this past June. So I would like to see a consistent effort to keep those updated, to include new companies, and make sure that the U.S. Goal of sanctioning and prohibiting Chinese military companies from accessing U.S. capital is enforced throughout.
I'd appreciate getting that list and working with you on that and making sure that we are updating that. But I will point out, I think the Trump administration did a good job going after Chinese communist military companies, working to try to help the Uyghurs. I think that they've done a legion work. The Trump administration really deserves a lot of credit for what they've done, and I appreciate, Mr. Chairman, that we want to build on that success. Yield back.
Thank you. I ask unanimous consent to put on the record a letter from Muddy Waters Capital LLC highlighting their work to research fraud involved in Chinese publicly traded companies, including Luckin Coffee that I mentioned earlier. And with that, hearing no objection will be entered in the record. I recognize the gentleman from Wisconsin for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Sherman and Ranking Member Huizenga, for holding today's hearing. The rise of China is one of the most serious economic and geopolitical challenges we face. The Chinese Communist Party has embarked on an aggressive campaign to expand its influence around the world. A key part of the campaign is Made in China 2025. Through this initiative, the CCP aims to make China the dominant player in high-tech manufacturing. Thinking of the important goods that power our modern economy, cars, computers, IT, aircraft, agriculture, technology, and medical devices, China wants to dominate all of those industries. In order to do this, Beijing is prepared to deploy subsidies, back foreign acquisitions, and impose forced technology transfer agreements. It's a direct challenge to the American workers and manufacturers, but it's a challenge that we can overcome. I find it, though, interesting we're holding this hearing as my colleagues across the aisle are considering massive tax increases on American workers and on American manufacturers. This Made in America tax will make it even harder to outcompete China. If we're concerned about Made in China 2025, the last thing we should do is impose a Made in America tax. My colleagues across the aisle are putting forward policies to destroy jobs in America, weaken the U.S. economy, and put us at a further disadvantage to communist China. Let me shift gears. Mr. Lorber, I want to reference an op-ed published by my colleagues, Mr. Luchtenmeyer and Mr. Huizenga, in which they argued that capital controls and delistings alone won't change China's behavior. They argued we need to bring sanctions into the policy toolkit, specifically for dealing with China. In your testimony, you described some of the ways our government has sanctioned China-based individuals and companies engaged in activity that the U.S. opposes. In targeting sanctions, could you add some color as to how we should draw the line between truly benign companies and those actually involved in activities against U.S. interests?
Yeah, it's a great question, and candidly, it can be a challenging line to draw. So, for example, companies that don't provide sufficient financial information or financial disclosure, frankly, may not be the best target of targeted sanctions because they're not engaged in potentially, actual national security threatening activity. Whereas other companies, for example, as assessed by both the Trump and the Biden administration, and as Ms. Chu was talking about, are involved in the Chinese civil-military fusion program and are working to bolster the Chinese military. And in that situation, I think sanctions would be potentially a more appropriate use of the tool.
Good. I appreciate your point in context. Looking at the U.S. sanctions regime in particular to hold some of these types of companies accountable, are there any tweaks or changes that you would recommend in the sanctions regime under U.S. law?
I don't think I would recommend specific tweaks or changes. I think the question is, are there other entities that the U.S. government believes pose national security threats, to Mrs. Chu's point from earlier, that may justify, targeting? I think that would be the way I'd frame it.
Let me shift gears once again. As you're well aware, China is the largest official creditor in the world, and though the Chinese development finance hasn't yet eclipsed the World Bank or the IMF, a heavily U.S. influenced institution, I think it does pose a pretty significant geopolitical and economic challenge. What are the steps that you think Congress should be making that we can take to counter Chinese influence in developmental finance?
I apologize. I probably need to defer on that question and get back to you. That's not my area of expertise in development finance. So I'd want to take a look at that question a bit more deeply.
We'll continue the discussion offline. I appreciate you all being here today. Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding today's hearing. I yield back.
Thank you. Now, gentlemen, recognize Mr. Mooney, the gentleman from West Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the great problems of today is how free market societies should confront the rising threat of China, a communist authoritarian state with increasing power on the world stage. Our trade deficit with China was $310 billion last year, an alarming reflection on China's economic power. What makes China such a unique adversary is that, unlike the Soviet Union, their leadership has not been as ideologically rigid. China's leadership has been willing to manipulate market forces to their geopolitical advantage. My question is for Ms. Sutter. In your testimony, you wrote about how American investors have limited access to passive investments in China. You talk about the differences between an American investor holding passive Chinese investments and a Chinese company and a Chinese investor holding shares directly in the same company. Do passive investments give Americans the same control as a typical shareholder?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. I think in my remarks, what I was trying to emphasize is that China is very highly restricted and closed in strategic sectors, a lot of the areas of growth in the economy, and that they may be using financial investment in tandem with technology licensing to get the capital and know-how they know without having to let U.S. competitors compete actually within the Chinese market. The other point I'd like to make on passive investment that we haven't talked about is under Made in China 2025, the government's use of government guidance funds, which is a private equity model in how the Chinese government, the Ministry of Finance, basically pushes state money into the Chinese economy, which is also used in the overseas markets, including for acquisitions and investments in other firms. I think this private equity model is something to think about as it touches the U.S. economy. So of course, financial investment, portfolio investment is by nature passive, but I think the concern I was trying to raise for consideration is China using this as a substitute for allowing productive U.S. competition on the ground in the Chinese market.
All right, well, as a follow-up to that, in your testimony, you wrote at length about how China seeks U.S. capital to fund its strategic interests. So how does that work? Can you explain that further?
Yes, and this has been raised in various areas of concern, that a lot of the Chinese companies who list on U.S. exchanges or who are included in U.S. funds increasingly are participants in the Made in China 2025 and other Chinese industrial policies. So U.S. capital going into these companies could be supporting these programs more broadly. And I'd like to raise for consideration that because China's Made in China 2025 policies are co-developed by the PLA, by the party, and by the state, that it poses a challenge for the United States to delineate what is truly a company that is military, what is truly a company that is of concern, especially as you get into dual use and strategic and emerging technologies. I think this becomes increasingly gray, potentially.
Well, thank you. Let me just say in conclusion that free market competition is what leads to growth and prosperity. Those who succeed in a free market are tested by the rigors of their competitors and how they serve their clients and they serve the people. China does not believe in capitalism. China does not believe in free markets the way we understand them in America, but China is willing to use our financial markets against us. They're more than willing to steal our intellectual property and tap into our wealth in order to further their nationalistic designs. On the surface, China is willing to make it seem as though they're merely participating in the global markets as equals, but in reality, they're manipulating our openness for their own ends. So to understand how to best react to China's threats, we must first come to terms with who they are. They're a geopolitical adversary that is always looking for weakness to expose in order to gain an edge. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. Now I recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the chairman allowing me to wave on to this subcommittee as a member of the National Security Subcommittee of this full committee, the ranking Republican on the National Security Subcommittee, member of the House China Task Force, and a member of the Asia Pacific Subcommittee on House Foreign Affairs Committee. This topic is of acute interest to me. And I want to thank the witnesses for the outstanding testimony. It's been very, very helpful as we consider legislative response to the challenge of China and Western capital flows to China. Earlier this year, I introduced the Chinese Military and Surveillance Company Sanctions Act, which has received broad support from my colleagues on both the Financial Services Committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee. The bill seeks to address one of the problems we're discussing here today: malign Chinese entities using American capital to fuel efforts that directly counter U.S. national security interests. The bill expands on President Trump's executive order targeting Chinese military companies as amended by President Biden's executive order, and my bill takes it a step further. Instead of simply banning investment in public equity issued by these companies, it directs the president to actively sanction them. Mr. Lorber and Ms. Chu, can you all elaborate on why a bill like mine, which leverages the U.S. sanctions regime, is preferable to a ban on public equity investment, as was the case with the executive orders, or enhanced disclosures such as the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act? And by the way, Mr. Chairman, I supported your bill, the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act, because Chinese companies are not playing by the same rules as other foreign companies. And I support your bill to accelerate the timeline to 2 years. But that legislation is an investor protection bill. It is not a foreign policy or national security bill. So what do sanctions achieve that these disclosures do not, Mr. Lorber?
Thank you, Representative Barr. The primary differences between the current executive orders that are in place that you referenced and the proposed legislation is the scope of the prohibition. So right now, under the current executive orders, the companies that are identified, U.S. persons are prohibited from transacting in publicly traded securities, but that's it. By actually designating the entities that are contained on the list, you would actually prohibit U.S. persons from transacting with them in any way. In addition, the scope of the executive order is limited to the specific companies that are identified on the list, but by blocking them, by adding them to the SDN list, you would actually automatically include any companies that those listed entities own or control. So the scope of it would be much, much broader.
And Ms. Chu, when you answer the question, could you also explain the mechanics of Ofac designations? So in other words, take an index like MSCI or BlackRock's announcement on August 30th that it would triple American investments in China. Explain how that might change and alter the composition of these index and these investments.
Thank you for the question. So in the past 3 years, I believe it was May 2018 when MSCI began or announced I was going to begin including Chinese A shares in its indices. The exposure of U.S. investors to A shares, which are companies listed on the Shanghai and Shenzhen exchanges, has shot up exponentially. There were none at that point, only H shares and ADRs. And so I believe that applying sanctions to Chinese military companies and Chinese surveillance companies, in addition to existing restrictions on capital investment, would be an ideal way to align national security objectives across sanctions programs.
Now, when Ofac were sanctioned these entities, the MSCI and the index would presumably have to pull out those designated firms from their index. Is that correct?
Right. I believe that the executive orders and the Ofac implementation require divestment by of securities or exposure to these securities, but it was unclear, and there are a lot of index providers and investment companies that were struggling for a long time, especially ended last year, to figure out if they were supposed to implement this, if there were any sort of enforcement measures. So I believe those factors should all be made more clear, and potentially an amendment to the ways that these capital market sanctions and restrictions can be applied.
And Mr. Lorber, can you talk about the force multiplier of sanctions versus U.S. securities disclosures in terms of preventing a circumvention and a rerouting of capital to foreign exchanges?
Yeah, exactly. It's a good point. So there is the usual occurrence where when the U.S. government, for example, Ofac sanctions somebody, as long as there's U.S. jurisdiction, non-U.S. companies are obliged to follow those rules and regulations. And so what you would see is oftentimes non-U.S. persons, non-U.S. companies operating in foreign jurisdictions wouldn't touch those securities because they would be blocked property. So there would be a significant extension of the impact beyond just U.S.
It would have a multilateral impact.
Yeah.
My time has expired, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, and appreciate your leadership on the disclosures front. We're just making the point that Ofac is another important tool. Yield back.
Thank you. As is our tradition, I'll be recognizing the ranking member, then myself for very brief closing comments. But before I do, and before I forget, without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days in which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for the response. I'll ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. Without objections, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion on the record. I remind members that written questions and materials for the record should be submitted to the email address that has been provided to your offices. The ranking member is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the panelists for being here today. Very illuminating and informative and helpful. One special person I do want to recognize, I know Ms. Ross has a special guest assistant with her, and sorry, it's our jobs as parents to embarrass our kids. I've got kids about the same age, but glad you've participated, and frankly, I will note that you had more stamina than most of the members of Congress making it through a 2-hour-plus hearing. So, but this is why we're doing this. This is why we are all here, is to make sure our kids and our grandkids have a better future than what we have. And that's why this question, this issue is so important to what we are talking about. And that really is, I think, the common motivator for so many of us. I did hear a couple of common themes today. Common theme of 1, China cheats. This is China writ large. It could be the Chinese Communist Party. It could be the Chinese Army. Could be all of the business entities that are either shell or they might be partially related or whatever they are. But we know that China does cheat. We also know that China controls things as much as they possibly can. And we know that, number 3, China is out for China. They are not out for their investors. They are not out for their citizens. They are not out for the world economy. They're out for China and their way of life and their governmental structure. And I would think that if you can accept 1, 2, and 3, then you have to ask the question, how will additional rules, requirements, demands, temper tantrums, whatever it is, how is that going to change China's actions? And that's what this is about. And I don't think those things will. What does get China's attention is sanctions, economic pressure, sanctions, and a strong, robust U.S. economy that can not just compete, but can actually outdo, can offer even better options than what they can. And not just in our country, but around the world. So we need a positive environment for our entrepreneurs, our small innovators, our risk takers, the things that have made the U.S. such a powerful force in this world, and a force for good, by the way. There's more people that have been lifted out of poverty with capitalism versus socialism or communism. There are more opportunities that have happened across the board for every single citizen of any country that has taken that route, and we need to encourage that. And I just want to emphasize that as we're looking at lots of discussions outside of this committee as well, what is going to be getting done here in our economy. We need to be conscious of this. What is separating us from other areas and other countries in the world like China, and how are we going to maintain our edge? And it is through creating an environment that allows others to succeed and for us to succeed. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I do appreciate you doing this hearing today, and I look forward to the conversation, look forward to learning more about your bills that you have are in the process of drafting, and I look forward to this continuation.
Look forward to
With that, I
working
yield
with you.
back.
Before I took over this subcommittee, I chaired the subcommittee on Asia over on Foreign Affairs, working with Mr. Barr. Come to the opinion that on the big issues that that affect China across the board, South China Sea, Belt and Road, the running of a huge trade surplus for them with the United States, their theft of IP, the big things. Nothing's going to change Chinese behavior except across-the-board tariffs on their entire economy. That even sanctions on one or two companies won't be enough to change their overall policy. But that's outside the jurisdiction of this subcommittee and the full committee for that matter. Focusing on the jurisdiction of this subcommittee, we've seen an illustration of the power that China has through selective access by allowing some banks, some investment banks to have access to China, but not others. They have control over what Morgan Stanley advises its clients and what Morgan Stanley publishes in its index, which then makes us wonder whether those who publish indexes should be required to register as investment advisors so that we get that fiduciary responsibility in that process to counterbalance the power that China would otherwise have. I believe it was Mr. Gonzalez that pointed out that whatever we do in our markets, American investors can always go elsewhere. And that is true. We're a free country. You can take your life savings, sell your house, put all the money in a suitcase, go to Monaco and put it all on 00. But the purpose of this subcommittee is to protect those investors who are investing in U.S. markets, U.S. exchanges, trust funds regulated by U.S. laws, ERISA plans and mutual funds, etc. Those who do that expect to have some investor protection. Those in Monaco, you're up to the laws of that principality. Mr. Himes points out that we've had accounting frauds in the United States. I was here for Enron and WorldCom. That's why we passed Sarbanes-Oxley and established the PCAOB. We needed it. That's why we passed it. We needed it to protect American investors. And it isn't just China that didn't cooperate. Belgium didn't cooperate. But we passed the bill last year, and we got tough with Belgium, and Big Waffle folded. And now we've got the deal with Belgium. Hopefully we'll get the same out of China as well. The purpose of that bill and the acceleration bill is to protect investors by getting the same kinds of controls that we found we needed after WorldCom and Enron, and that we clearly need for Chinese companies as well. The VIE structure means that you're not a shareholder. People should understand that. And you're not one of the 1,000 biggest companies in the world if you're Alibaba, Cayman Islands. You don't belong in indexes. You're not even a company. You're an investment, I don't know what you are. You're a shell that invests in another shell that has a contractual relationship. When you invest in a Chinese company, you may not have any right to elect the board. When even those who do elect the board may put the interests of the Chinese Communist Party above those who elect them. And even if the board seeks to deploy the assets of the company to further the interests of shareholders, the government is free to sanction, seize, redirect, all without the protections of a legal system designed to protect private property. So we've got a lot to do to protect American investors who invest in China, and even more to do with the overall relationship with China. This hearing is adjourned.